She didn't call him by name. She didn't even look at him. Just pointed to the back of the plane and said, "Sir, I need you to move." Not a question. Not a choice. And maybe it seems small to some folks. But how many times does a man have to be told, without words, that he doesn't belong? It was early boarding at gate 22, not even 7 a.m. yet, and the overhead speakers had just called for Group 1. The line moved slow, the kind of tired slow that comes from too little sleep and too much travel. Thomas Ridley didn't rush. He never did. He stepped forward with a quiet nod to the gate agent, his shoulders square, his step steady, but measured, always measured. His right hip didn't move like it used to, not since the desert heat and the dust and the weight of years past. He didn't wear a veteran's hat. No jacket with patches. Just a pressed button-down, clean jeans, and a small duffel bag. You wouldn't know he served unless you were paying attention, and most people weren't. Tom found his seat, 14C, aisle, up front, just behind first class. He didn't smile, but he eased into the cushion like someone who knew how much comfort cost when you didn't have it. One leg stretched out a little to the side, careful. It took him 3 tries to tuck the duffel under the seat in front without twisting too hard. That's when she came. Young, polished, tablet in hand. Her tone clipped like something was already running late. She stopped beside him, barely glanced down. "Sir, I'm going to need you to move to seat 31B. We have a family that needs to sit together." She said it fast, like it was just another routine thing. But something in her voice, not the words, but the space between them, made Tom's hands still. His left hand, resting on his thigh, twitched once. Not anger. Just a familiar signal, here we go again. He didn't argue. Just looked up, made sure he heard her right. 31B, he asked, voice low. She nodded once, already tapping her screen. No apology. No explanation for why he was the one being asked. He'd paid for this seat weeks ago. It wasn't about comfort, it was the only spot his hip could handle for a cross-country flight. But that didn't matter now. Not when a mother and her 2 kids needed a block of 3. The seat was near the lavatories, she said. Middle row. Full flight. No aisle seats left. He said nothing. Not yet. He only glanced at the laminated card in his wallet, VA, medical boarding, then closed it again without showing it. There was a kind of hush in the cabin then. Not silence, just the shift of air when a line's been crossed, but no one sure who noticed. Some folks looked away. A few stared. And Thomas Ridley stayed seated, for just a moment longer than expected. Long enough for the story to begin. Tom didn't stand right away. He sat there in 14C, fingers resting on the edge of the armrest, as if weighing not just the request, but what it meant to be asked. The aisle had gone still. People were boarding behind him, sure, but in that moment, the rows nearby grew quiet in a way that only happens when someone senses discomfort and chooses not to name it. The attendant didn't press him. Not yet. She just stood, waiting. Not rude. Not impatient. Just expecting. Like she'd done this 100 times before and saw no reason this would be any different. Tom gave a quiet breath and looked up at her. "All right," he said, low and level. "If it's that important." He didn't say it for sympathy. He said it like someone who'd learned long ago that sometimes, even when you have every right to stay, it costs more than it gives. It took him a moment to get up. His right leg didn't fully extend like it used to, and the angle of the seat made the first push harder than it should have been. He didn't ask for help. He never did. He lifted his duffel, stepped into the aisle, and began the long walk back. The plane wasn't large, but today the distance, just 17 rows, felt longer than it had any right to. Like each step pulled something from him. Not pain, exactly. Something heavier. A woman across the aisle glanced up, gave a faint smile. Then looked back down at her phone. Seat 31B was in the back third of the cabin. Cramped. Middle seat. Window taken. A broad-shouldered man in business attire was already in the aisle seat, typing into a laptop without looking up. Tom slid into place, careful again. He moved slow, not because he wanted to, because he had to. His hip didn't like sharp angles, and the back rows didn't offer much grace. Once seated, he folded his hands over the duffel in his lap and stared forward. He didn't reach for a magazine. Didn't look around. Just breathed slow and even, steadying himself. The VA card had shifted slightly in his wallet, peeking from the pocket as if it, too, wanted to speak. But Tom tucked it back down, like a truth not yet ready to be told. No one said anything. No one asked if he was all right. And in that silence, one filled not with malice, but something colder, he sat alone between strangers, in a seat he hadn't chosen, carrying weight no one could see. It wasn't just a seat. And it wasn't just a move. It was a message. One that had traveled far too many miles before ever leaving the ground. Tom took his time walking. Not because he wanted to slow things down, but because his body didn't give him much choice anymore. The aisle wasn't wide, and the plane had started to fill up. Bags in laps. Shoulders brushing. Quiet conversation about nothing in particular. He nodded gently when someone made space, even if they didn't look up. Each step toward the back felt less like moving through a plane and more like moving through something heavier. Like walking through a kind of permission, given quietly, by everyone, permission to make a man like him feel smaller. There were no glares. No cruel words. That would have been easier in some way. Easier to name. What he got instead was polite silence. Eyes that shifted just before his met them. Expressions that said, "This isn't my business," but couldn't quite hide the discomfort. About halfway down, someone whispered, "Isn't that the guy from up front?" Another voice, quieter, "He must have caused a problem." Tom didn't react. He just kept walking. The duffel strap tugged at his shoulder a little harder now. His hip stiffened with every few feet. But he didn't reach for the seats as he passed. Didn't ask for help. A flight attendant, one he hadn't seen yet, stepped aside for him near row 26. She smiled faintly. He nodded once. No words exchanged. Just a glance that almost said something, but didn't. When he reached row 31, he paused. The man in the aisle seat was still typing, elbows wide, posture claiming more space than the seat allowed. Tom waited. Not long, but long enough that it became clear he wouldn't force his way through. The businessman finally noticed him, glanced once, then shifted just enough to let him pass. "Middle seat?" he asked flatly. Tom answered with a quiet, "Yes, sir." No bitterness. Just acknowledgement. The young woman by the window pulled her bag in closer to her lap. She didn't smile. She didn't frown either. She just turned toward the glass and stayed there. Tom slid into the space between them. Not tight. Not painful. Just wrong. Like wearing someone else's name tag. He adjusted the duffel on his lap, made sure his shoulders weren't pressing against anyone, and let out a slow, measured breath. He had done harder things. That much was true. But even still, this was a seat that came with its own kind of quiet. A different kind of weight. And nobody noticed the way his hands stayed folded in his lap. Or how he hadn't blinked in a while. From where he sat now, the front of the plane felt like a different country. And dignity. Well, dignity never did travel light. The flight attendants began their walkthrough, checking bins, counting heads, tapping screens. One of them, a younger woman with soft curls pulled back into a clip, paused at row 31. She tilted her head and looked at Tom with something close to confusion. Not disrespectful, just uncertain. "Sir, didn't you board early?" Tom gave her the smallest nod, eyes steady. "Yes, ma'am." She blinked. "You sure this is your seat?" Before he could answer, Kayla Morrison, the senior attendant who'd asked him to move, stepped in from behind. Her voice came quick, too quick. "He was up front earlier. But we had a family situation. He agreed to relocate." The words dropped between them like a closed door. Polite enough, but said loud enough to carry. Loud enough for nearby passengers to hear without trying. Tom didn't say anything. Didn't explain. Didn't tell them about the bad hip or the VA boarding notice or the aisle seat he'd booked months ago so he wouldn't have to sit like this. He just nodded once more and looked down at his hands. The younger attendant hesitated, then nodded too, almost as if apologizing without knowing what for. She moved on. Across the aisle, someone cleared their throat. A man in khakis and a ball cap leaned toward the woman beside him and muttered, always complaining about something. The words weren't aimed at Tom. Not directly. But they landed just the same. Tom didn't flinch. He was used to second meanings. Used to the way people dressed assumptions in soft tones and sideways glances. The businessman beside him kept typing. The girl by the window had her earbuds in. No one said anything else. It wasn't hostility. It was indifference. The kind that doesn't raise its voice, but lowers your place. Tom adjusted his posture slightly, shifting his weight off the pressure point in his hip. He winced but made no sound. He reached into the front pocket of his shirt and touched the edge of a worn card. His VA medical ID. Still there. Still folded the same way since the day he laminated it himself at the post office in Rock Springs. He didn't take it out. Didn't hold it up or flash it like a badge. Because that's not how dignity speaks. It waits. Quiet. Patient. Heavy in the chest. And as the crew readied the cabin for departure, Tom sat still. A man who had said yes, not because he agreed, but because saying no would have cost more than comfort. That's the kind of yes people mistake for kindness. But kindness, real kindness, doesn't need to be silent to be strong. And compliance isn't always consent. The plane shifted slightly as someone closed an overhead bin a few rows up. That soft thump echoed down the narrow cabin like a door shutting behind a conversation no one wanted to finish. Thomas Ridley kept his gaze forward. His hands, still folded over the duffel in his lap, didn't move. Not even when the businessman beside him bumped his elbow again without apology. Not even when the girl at the window leaned away just a little farther, like space was something she owned more of. A few rows up, laughter stirred. Not cruel, just casual. The kind that fills a space where tension used to sit. Tom didn't join it. The senior flight attendant, Kayla Morrison, passed through once more. She stopped briefly at row 29, then looked back toward him. Not long. Just a glance. She didn't say anything. Maybe she thought she'd already done enough. Or maybe she hadn't thought much about it at all. But her silence didn't feel neutral. It felt like a page being turned too fast, leaving something behind unfinished. Tom sat with that. Not angry. Not bitter. Just still. He could have said something. Could have explained the boarding group. The medical note. The months of planning around that one aisle seat. But then what? So he could sound like a man defending his own decency? No. He'd been in too many rooms where his explanation became someone else's inconvenience. Where raising a point became raising his voice, no matter how calm he kept it. So he said nothing. He let them believe whatever filled the space he left blank. Outside the window, a baggage cart rolled by. The ground crew moved like clockwork, unfazed by anything above them. Tom watched them for a moment. That rhythm, that order, it used to mean something. Still did, maybe. Just not up here. The PA crackled. A voice announced final boarding. The door would be closing soon. Tom shifted in his seat, just slightly, to ease the tight pull in his lower back. The motion made him wince, but he didn't let the sound escape. The businessman beside him didn't notice. He was too busy typing, too focused on his screen, too used to comfort. Tom reached into his coat pocket and touched the corner of the VA card again. Just for a second. Just to remind himself it was still there. He didn't flash it. Didn't use it like proof. Because he didn't need to prove anything. He knew what he carried. And he knew that silence, when chosen, not forced, can carry more weight than any speech. Even if nobody hears it. 3 rows up, on the right side of the plane, Dr. Lenora Clark sat still with her tray table up and her hands folded loosely in her lap. She wasn't reading. She wasn't watching the safety video either. Her eyes had settled on something far quieter than any announcement. She had watched the man from the moment he boarded. Thomas Ridley. She didn't know his name yet. Didn't need to. The way he walked told her more than enough. A measured pace. Not slow for attention, just steady like someone who's learned the cost of falling behind. She'd noticed when he sat down in 14C. How he placed his bag under the seat carefully, like someone protecting something inside it. And she'd noticed when they came for him. When he stood without raising his voice. When he moved without resistance, without permission, without anyone in the row behind him offering so much as a glance. Lenora had served long enough to recognize the look on a man's face when he's being moved, not because he's wrong, but because it's easier for someone else if he just goes. Her uniform wasn't visible today. She wasn't wearing rank or ribbons. Just jeans and a soft blazer folded beside her. Civilian clothes. But nothing about her memory of service was civilian. She reached for her phone, thumb hovering over the screen for a moment. She didn't open the camera. Didn't think about posting. Instead, she opened her contacts and tapped a name, someone she knew in the airline's executive operations team. Someone who'd still pick up a message that started with, "I'm on this flight." Then she typed, "Black male passenger. Reassigned from 14C to 31B without warning. Boarding was medically flagged." No aggression. No conflict. Crew dismissive. Please escalate. Flight 482. She stared at the words a moment. Then hit send. There was no applause. No righteous energy. Just the quiet conviction that dignity deserved more than survival. Across the aisle, she saw him settle back again. One shoulder slightly lower than the other. One foot tucked in to keep his leg from cramping. She watched how he blinked slower than most. How he kept his hands folded, not because he was cold, but because there was nowhere else to put them without seeming too visible. She didn't know what would come of the message. Didn't know if anyone would read it in time. But sometimes, being the only one who noticed, was enough to start something. Not big. Not loud. Just something true. And as the flight crew moved toward final checks, Dr. Lenora Clark stayed seated. Quiet. Composed. But watching. Always watching. In the cockpit, Captain Richard Dunn sat with his hands resting gently on the yoke, headset still in place. The co-pilot beside him was finishing up the checklist, reading aloud with routine calm. But the captain wasn't hearing much of it. A soft chime blinked on the display. Incoming message. He glanced down. Corporate liaison. Internal notice. Flight 482. Passenger report. Black male. Moved from pre-assigned medical seat. No misconduct. No justification recorded. Below that, a name he recognized. Dr. Lenora Clark. A colonel in the reserves, if he remembered right. Quiet reputation. Precise with her words. Captain Dunn didn't hesitate. Hold taxi, he said. The co-pilot looked over, confused. Sir? He was already unbuckling. I'll be back in 3. He stood and pushed the cockpit door open with one steady motion. The cabin buzzed with soft conversation, the clink of seatbelt clasps, the hush of a settling plane. But the moment he stepped out, something shifted. Not everyone noticed. But those who did felt it. He walked without rush. Measured. Calm. His captain's stripes pressed sharp along his cuffs, his silver wings catching a sliver of overhead light. He made his way down the narrow aisle, past row 10. Past 17. Then 24. And then he stopped at 31B. Thomas Ridley looked up, surprised by the presence. His eyes moved slowly from the captain's chest to his eyes, unsure of what was about to come. Captain Dunn didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a show. He stood square in the aisle, and with the full weight of silence, he brought his right hand up and offered a crisp, formal salute. Not performative. Not delayed. Earned. The man beside Tom shifted slightly, suddenly aware of how little space he'd given the man next to him. The girl at the window pulled out her earbuds. A few passengers leaned just enough to catch what they were seeing, but said nothing. Mr. Ridley, the captain said quietly. You will not be sitting here today. He paused. I read the report. I know what happened. And I'm here to say, it's not going to end like that. Tom said nothing at first. He didn't blink. Captain Dunn didn't rush him. He simply extended a hand. Let us do right by you, sir. Tom moved slowly, rising with the same quiet care he always did. His duffel in one hand, the VA card still tucked in his chest pocket, untouched. The captain didn't let go of his elbow until he was steady. And as they turned toward the front of the plane, something unspoken passed through every row they walked past. Not shame. Not yet. But the beginning of it. They reached the front of the plane without a word. The rows didn't cheer. No one clapped. But silence, when it shifts, has a sound of its own. A few passengers sat a little straighter. Others looked down, like the tray tables in front of them had suddenly become more interesting than they really were. Captain Richard Dunn stopped beside seat 1A. The aisle was wide here. The air a little quieter. The light from the cabin windows softer on the leather headrest. The current passenger in 1A, a man in a navy golf shirt and pressed slacks, looked up in confusion. The captain leaned in, said something only the man could hear. And the man stood. No complaint. No delay. Just a quiet, "Yes, sir," as he stepped aside. Tom said nothing. He just lowered himself into the seat slowly, carefully. His hips still stiff. His back still aching. But this seat didn't carry weight. It carried space. He rested the duffel gently by his feet. Folded his hands again. And for the first time since he boarded, he let his shoulders fall just enough to breathe deeper. The VA card in his pocket didn't move. It didn't need to. A flight attendant approached. Not Kayla. Another one. Her voice softer than before. "Can I get you anything, Mr. Ridley?" Tom looked at her, not with suspicion, not with pride, just with clarity. "A window," he said. "That's all." She smiled faintly and stepped back. 3 rows behind, Dr. Lenora Clark watched from her seat, her phone resting face down now. She didn't need to send another message. The one that mattered had already been received. And in the cockpit, the captain sat back down. No grand speech. No overhead announcement. Just a quiet nod to the co-pilot, who picked up where they'd left off. Outside, the tarmac stretched wide and flat under a pale morning sun. And inside, in seat 1A, a man once moved without cause now sat still, with reason. No banners. No ceremony. Just one seat. One story. One reminder that even in the most ordinary places, a metal tube at 30,000 feet, respect is a choice. And sometimes, all it takes is one person who chooses to see. So if you've ever watched something wrong happen in front of you and wondered if noticing mattered, this is your answer. It does. Every time. And if stories like this stay with you, hit subscribe. Because on this channel, silence isn't the end. It's the place where dignity begins. What happened on Flight 482 wasn't just about a seat. It was about what that seat came to represent: a man's quiet dignity, tested in public, and restored not by force, but by recognition. Thomas Ridley didn't argue. He didn't demand. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held his place until someone else realized what had been taken from him. And when Captain Dunn stepped out of the cockpit, not because protocol told him to, but because decency did, that became the moment this story stopped being silent. In a world that too often asks black veterans to sacrifice twice, once in war, once in peace, this wasn't just justice. It was a reminder: dignity should never require explanation. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is notice. And then act. So here's the question: when was the last time you saw someone overlooked, and chose to speak up? If this story moved you, if it made you think of someone you know, or someone you hope to be, then don't let it stop here. Like the video. Share it. Subscribe to Black Veteran Stories. Because every seat holds a story. And every story deserves to be seen.